This is Ron Frenz, comics illustrator, and this is a bumper for the Amazing Spider Talk.
Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to dangle. I'll be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon. They'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The Amazing Spider Talk. The Amazing Spider Talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the Amazing Spider
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gvozden, and I'm the founder and editor of SuperiorSpiderTalk.com.
And I'm mischievous Mark Ginocchio, founder of the Chasing Amazing blog and author of 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for the 9th episode of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoy this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture.
Yes, Dan, all throughout this first season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk, you and I have been taking a journey down memory lane to the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko creative run on Amazing Spider-Man. The most recent episode, you and I talked about Spider-Man's role as a street-level hero. Today, we're going to go a little more creator-centric, and we're going to be talking about the co-creator, not who we consider to be the co-creator, but the co-creator of Spider-Man, none other than the great artist, Steve Ditko.
Who do we have joining us today on the show, Mark?
Well, we actually have two guests. Double your fun, Dan. Our first guest is Nick Caputo, who is a blogger. His site is Marvel Mysteries and Comics Minutia, but more for the purposes of this episode, he is a Steve Ditko expert who has done a lot of research and writing about Ditko over the years, and lots of great insights. And then our second guest, Dan, certainly no stranger to the show, a longtime friend of the podcast, the great legendary artist Ron Frenz, who is going to talk about Ditko's influences on him and to the industry at large from the artistic side.
Yeah, and like always for this episode, we're going to be talking about the entire Steve Ditko and Stan Lee run on the book. And when Ron Frenz comes on, we do talk about some of Ron's work. So if you want to catch up on Ron's work, you can start off with Amazing Spider-Man 252, where he and Tom DeFalco introduced the black suit into the pages of Amazing Spider-Man, and that you'll immediately recognize the similarities to Steve Ditko. And to that point, if you want to read along and read all of these runs, you can find it just about anywhere, print, digital, or as part of Marvel's Unlimited service. So, Mark, let's get right to it. This is a jam-packed episode. So, everybody, strap yourselves in for Ditko Shrugged. And now, the moment you've been waiting for, an interview with Steve Ditko.
Well, Dan, we are joined here for our Ditko episode to talk with Nick Caputo, who is a blogger and a writer. He is the man behind the blog Marvel Mysteries and Comics Minutia, but he's written for a ton of other sites, knows a lot about Ditko, the person, in terms of how that's kind of influenced his comics work. Has been following this for some years. Nick, why don't you say hi and introduce yourself?
Well, hello, folks. Glad to be here. It's an honor. I've listened to your previous post, and I can see you guys are knowledgeable about the work of Ditko and Spider-Man in particular, and then the comics. So that it's really nice to be allowed to speak a little bit about his work.
Excellent. Well, Dan, you and I, a few episodes ago, we had Bob Batchelor on to talk about Stan Lee in a little more detail. And obviously, when it comes to the Silver Age of Spider-Man, there is no Spider-Man. There's Lee, and then there's Steve Ditko. And in many ways, Steve Ditko's contributions to the Spider-Man mythos might be even more significant than Stan's. Yet, Dan, as you and I have talked about in the past, Stan seems to get more of the credit for various reasons. And we could talk a little bit about why that's the case. But, part of the reason why we wanted to have Nick on, of course, was, not that Steve Ditko is this huge mystery. I mean, we know obviously that he was very influential in the comic book world. We know that he is the co-creator of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and tons of other characters for a bunch of different comic book imprints. But because of, I guess you would say, Steve's nature, he doesn't seem to be as self-promotional as Stan Lee. I mean, he's notoriously, he doesn't give interviews. He doesn't talk publicly about his work. He does write a bunch of essays in The Comics, I think is the name of the publication. Is that
right?
Yeah,
that's Robin Snyder's Comics. Yes. From what I've read over the years and what I've seen, he does not consider himself a celebrity of any kind. He is more an intense person that just wants to do his work, do his comic books. He doesn't see himself in any manner as a celebrity. And I think that's what differentiates himself from a lot of others, is that he's never looked at it that way. And his really intense interest in work is in what he's doing. Sitting there at the drawing board and doing that work is the most important thing to him.
One of the things that I think is really interesting to note about Steve Ditko in terms of Spider-Man and his comic book work and is, obviously, we often hear a lot about the kind of debate over creator rights, specifically when it is regarding the artists and their rights to a creation. And we get that a lot with Jack Kirby because it seems like Kirby really got zero credit when it came to a lot of his co-creations with Stan Lee. Ditko, obviously, you can make the case that he deserves significantly more credit than he's gotten, but he does seem to have a leg up on Kirby in the fact that he started basically plotting the entire issue of Amazing Spider-Man around issue 10, and around issue number 25 he actually got the written credit on in the credits page on Amazing Spider-Man that he was the I think he written as co-plotter or plotter. I mean, like he got credit where Kirby never did.
It was plotter from 25 on. I think he wanted that, and he received that. I think he was doing a lot of the plotting earlier on, not all of it. I think what could pinpoint where it probably ended completely with Stan plotting was probably with the end of guest stars, because Ditko did not like using guest stars, did not like bringing on the characters into his Spider-Man world, thought it interfered with creating those characters and developing the plotting of the subplots and everything else. So the last time you saw a character appearing that Stan plotted was probably Amazing Spider-Man, was it 23, with the Human Torch and the Beetle, both outside characters. So definitely, and Ditko's talked about that story. So that Stan was still plotting it, at least up to there, which doesn't mean that Ditko wasn't plotting earlier stories, but, there was an input with Stan, at least up to that point. By 25, or a little bit before 25, is from Ditko's statements, is when he was solely plotting everything. Of course, there were other things that happened. The college storyline, obviously, was something that was talked about earlier, and Ditko finally mentioned that recently, where he wasn't talking to Stan wasn't talking to him anymore, and he went to Flo and said, does Stan want me to continue does he still want Peter to go to college? And she said, yeah. And obviously they had talked about that before. And Stan actually did a storyline the year before in Patsy Walker. What did she do? Graduate. It was a big storyline. It was a cover story. She went to college. She graduated. This was a year before Peter Parker ever did it. In other comics, you saw Johnny Storm go to college. So, there was, that points to Stan's involvement or idea. Ditko went along with it. So supposedly he may have thought about that for a while, wasn't sure if he wanted to do it. He went along with it, and, that storyline was there. But this was something that they discussed probably quite a while earlier. Ditko, from what I've seen and what I've read, he's always plotted things out way in advance, thought things out very seriously, how it was going to go. Same thing with the Green Goblin. Supposedly thought that up from day one, that it would be a character that became Norman Osborn. So that points to, a lot of thought and a lot of involvement from day one.
Well, that's really interesting that you say that. I'm curious then, if he's planning so far in advance, but this college thing was kind of a Stan Lee, not creation, but I guess suggestion, if you will. How much can we attribute the creator aspect to Ditko in regards to like the supporting characters that were introduced alongside the college? Like, are Harry Osborn and Gwen Stacy and all of these characters solely Ditko creations?
I think so. Yeah, I think that was all Ditko's idea, to move on, to come up with new characters. Harry, of course, eventually, and he mentioned this in one of his essays, was Norman Osborn's son. He didn't look like a really nice kid the way he drew him, obviously. So he would have probably turned out to be a creep, too, if he drew him. He had the same hairstyle. He mentioned him. He never mentioned the names because he didn't come up with the names. But he said the same distinct hairstyle. That was Harry. That was Norman. Gwen Stacy, I'm pretty sure, was something he had come up with on his own. All those characters. Yeah, I think he would have developed them, and probably in different ways if he continued on Spider-Man. I always suspect that Gwen Stacy would have been a much different character. She probably would have learned Peter Parker's identity, Spider-Man's identity, like he did with the Blue Beetle. That's just a guess, but I think that she would have been somebody that would have been equal to him on many levels, and he would have confided in her.
One of the things that the senses I've always gotten from, some of the essays that I've read by Ditko was that he was not afraid to push back against Stan Lee. I mean, there was I think back to when he was talking about Amazing Spider-Man #2, and I guess Stan's initial pitch for the Vulture was he kind of wanted to be this like heavy set character,
right.
And I think Ditko made the joke that it would look like a flying turkey or something.
Right.
And
yeah, he said he liked doing heavy set characters, and he didn't think it worked for that type of character, Sidney Greenstreet type, which became the Kingpin later on, which worked for that character certainly, and Dr. Octopus wasn't exactly, a skinny guy. He was a little bit more like a more heavy set character, but it worked for him. So he really thought this out, and when he thought something didn't work, I think he would certainly talk with Stan, discuss issues with him, and they come to an agreement of some kind. And I think Stan gave him a lot of, ability to do what he wanted, as long as he was happy with it. I think that's what their relationship was early on. I think that ended, unfortunately, and I think one of the reasons Ditko was unhappy, and he didn't stay much longer when they stopped talking to each other, was that there was not that communication between the two. He wanted that, and when he didn't have that anymore, he just felt like, he was doing it all himself. He didn't know as a freelance if he was going to continue in a job. There was that reality. And as he said when he talked about leaving Spider-Man a couple of years ago, in his essay, Sal Brodsky calls him and tells him, we're doing a Spider-Man annual #3, plot that. And he just sat there and thought to himself, this is, that's what I'm going to do. I think it's time to go. How do I know if I'm going to be here much longer? There's no input. So I think as a freelancer, you also have to look at it in a realistic way. If you're not talking to one of the main people there, how do you know if you keep getting work? They say goodbye tomorrow. So when he left there, he certainly got lots of accounts. He was working for Charlton, which he always worked for Charlton, even when he was working at Marvel. Dell, Warren, Tower, so he certainly, kept himself open, and he always had a job at Charlton. So as long as they were there, he worked for them.
And also when he was doing Doctor Strange around the same time for Marvel, I mean, that was Stan had even less input on that, right? I mean, that was really all Steve from start to finish for the most part, right?
Well, the early issues, Stan plotted a lot of the early issues. He was involved with it. But again, Steve was unhappy for a lot of reasons, mainly because he brought other inkers in. I think he wanted Steve probably to do more work to help him out with stuff as an inker. You know, last minute jobs, Steve helped out a lot of times when there was deadlines. And, you know, he figured he'd be more useful that way. And Ditko's idea was like, I don't need, you know, other people inking this stuff. I could do it myself. You know, he didn't want it, George Rousseau or others to be there. He wanted to do the complete job. Stan was plotting. He also gave it to other people sometimes, such as Don Rico. And according to Ditko, he came to him one time, and Stan was thinking of canceling the strip. And, you know, Steve said, look, let me do it myself. I got ideas for this. Let me plot it. Let me draw it. And that basically, I think, starts the whole Dormammu saga, what I would call in terms of, you know, graphic novel in a way of that period, and some of his finest work on Doctor Strange. But, you know, basically he did push for that to do it on his own. But earlier on, Stan was you know, plotting some of those stories.
So since Steve doesn't really do interviews, you know, it allowed Stan Lee to kind of, well, not even just allowed him. Stan Lee was a guy in the spotlight and really liked to kind of be the press man. And it's kind of allowed Stan to shape history in a way, right? Because he's the one getting the stories out there. I'm curious about, you know, the kind of back and forth between the creation of the Spider-Man character. Like, who was Stan Lee before he was brought onto this project? How did he get involved? And then what input do you see Ditko as having in regards to the creation of the character?
Well, you know, Ditko's contribution, I think, was pretty huge. There was a Spider-Man concept. There was something that came before, obviously, with Jack Kirby that we've never seen, the published artwork of. Those who have seen it said it looked more like a Captain America type. There was a lot of differences. I think Steve, when he saw the pencil pages he was supposed to ink, realized that it looked since he knew comics again, this points to him being knowledgeable. He saw Simon and Kirby's Fly, and he thought it looked familiar and similar to that. I think, again, this is just conjecture, but I suspect that Stan, or I don't know if it got to the publisher, Martin Goodman, who would have been pleased, but the publishers of Archie Comics were very litigious, and they would sue at the drop of a hat. I don't think they wanted to have anything to do with anything that looked like the Fly. They don't want to get sued. That's why they said, drop everything, Steve. I'll plot it with you. The first story obviously had a lot of Stan's ideas and storyline plotting was there. A lot of it references the earlier Rawhide Kid, had the same origin. His uncle is killed. His Uncle Ben is killed. And there are certainly elements of Stan's plot there. But as you move on, and we moved on, you know, certainly the first issue, Ditko references using John Jameson and an astronaut going into space was a Stan plot. The Tinkerer, space aliens was a Stan plot. Other ideas was Stan plots there, but Steve was definitely, you know, going in a certain direction and really felt, you know, again, put a lot of work into it, took it seriously, and added the visual element, which is so important also. I mean, basically, he created that whole look, the costume, the webbing, the face, a teenage character that looks like a teenager. There were so many elements there that attract you. I was a kid. It attracted me immediately. You know, there was something about it that really, really drew you in. The vulnerability of that character. If you look at one of the covers I'm going to put up soon on my blog, Amazing Spider-Man 15 with Kraven the Hunter. I remember that as a kid. Here it is. This character is stuck. He's trapped. And this character, Kraven's advancing on him. You know, and here it is. This, you know, it wasn't a guy with its, you know, he's in danger, you know. That was a big point, too. You know, he didn't look like this huge, imposing, powerful character that could beat anybody. You know, he might get hurt.
And didn't Ditko really push for the idea of having Spider-Man in a mask because he wanted that to kind of, again, like, it was off-putting, it was unnerving, but it also kind of lent the idea that anybody could be under that mask, which I think has been an important part of who Spider-Man is, and even like, you know, other versions of Spider-Man we've gotten over the years. It's that idea that it really can be anybody. It doesn't have to just be, you know, someone that looks like Peter Parker. I mean, that's part of the mystery of the character.
According to Ditko, yeah, he really wanted to have that look, to have the face covered because it's covering, again, a young face, youthful face. You could be anybody under the mask. You don't know who it is. Gives you a sense of mystery. And you didn't have too many characters like that. There were a few here and there. The Ghost Rider, of course, the Western Ghost Rider was one. There were others. And I'm sure he may have been remembered some of those, inspired by some of those. But yeah, that was a big part of it, that the face was covered. And you could, you know, as a fan, a reader, you could think of yourself as that person underneath that mask. So
I'm curious about Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's early relationship working on this book. I mean, is it that the relationship deteriorated over time? Was there ever anything like really like clicking between the two of them where they were like a true partnership? Or did it always kind of start off in a not great place for Steve Ditko in terms of kind of feeling that there was an equal share regarding the character?
That's a good question. You know, I can't put words into anybody's mouth. I don't know. He's never really addressed that issue. You have to remember, though, that they went back to a working relationship for, 1956 when he first started doing mystery stories for Stan. One of the first stories he did was a Western signed by Stan. So they worked together for a while. Stan obviously admired his work. So there was really kind of almost a 10-year relationship, which is a long time, at Marvel, Atlas and Marvel. I think there was certainly more when they were working on the fantasy stories, which was less involved. Stan was still giving him a plot synopsis. He said he always worked from a plot synopsis. I think there was probably more interaction early on. That's my guess. And there might have been more give and take early on, but certainly, there was a lot. They probably didn't see eye to eye on certain things. Ditko has brought up a lot of those in the essays you've read. The fact that he wanted Stan took a lot of interest in what fans had to say from early on. He bought the fanzines. He read the fanzines. He took seriously. Ditko didn't take as much seriously as much, even though he drew for the fans. He was very generous to fans and drew a lot of artwork for them. But he didn't take everything they said seriously. And Stan tended to, do that. Aunt May, make her look prettier. Make her look younger. He was like, no, she's he took it seriously. This is Aunt May. This is an older woman. Draw her that way. Once Ramita came in, you saw her. She got 10 years younger, 15 years younger. Jameson, he said he's not likable enough, when you say you're not supposed to be likable, he's the guy that you're supposed to dislike. And he mentioned a radio series called The Great Gildersleeve, Fibber McGee and Molly, where this character played a very, not a pleasant guy, and he was always a grumpy character. Everybody loved to hate him, and he thought of him when he was doing Jameson. So there was these disagreements here and there where to Ditko it didn't make sense, And Stan was like, you got to please the fans, and I think there was that disruption, probably grew as the years went on. And, according to Ditko, of course, he said Stan stopped talking to him. I don't know what the reasoning was for that. I suspect part of it might be because Ditko was so intense in his work. He liked going over the page by page, panel by panel. That's how we work. When he come in, get the pencils, show Stan the artwork when they were speaking to each other, and they go over every little thing. If he wanted changes, they discuss it. That took a lot of time. Stan was doing every book, was involved in editing every title, every story. Maybe he just didn't feel he had the time. He could handle that. He could have the time to do all that and spend an hour or 2 hours with Steve. I don't know, but I think something went wrong there, and the ability to communicate with each other and not communicate with each other was probably the nail in the coffin.
Now, we're obviously talking about a lot of different relationship dynamics here, and I think this is probably as good as a time as any to kind of segue into Steve Ditko's personal philosophy and kind of how that both affected his relationship with Stan and Marvel, and obviously his output on Spider-Man and other comics as well. Ditko is, he is a follower to some degree. I know it's not 100% true.
Right. Yeah, not totally.
to objectivism, which is kind of based on the writings and the philosophy of and I always say her first name wrong. Is it Ayn Rand? Is it Ayn Rand? Yeah, I've been corrected.
Got it wrong for a long time. Yes.
Ayn Rand, writer of Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and my very basic understanding of objectivism is the kind of at the core of it is the value of the individual and the individual rights versus the rights of the group or society. So, when you're talking about wanting what's best for the book versus giving into the fans or, pushing back against Stan when he wants the Vulture to look like a flying turkey or anything like that. I mean, it does seem like it's coming from a place of that, right? I mean, is that too much of a leap of faith to be making here?
No, I think a lot of that comes from there. The thing is, it's I don't think Ditko could appreciate people being arbitrary, just making arbitrary decisions. And this will, let's throw in this guest star and let's have this villain here from Submariner. And to him, it didn't make sense, and I think it's just his process of thinking. Besides the fact of his interest in objectivism and everything, is his process of thinking a story through. I've seen that in his own stories that he's done. He thinks everything through. He plots things out. I think he... if something doesn't make sense to him, it really, really bothers him. Like, why are you doing this? Why would you want to do something like this? And why are you doing it for, a fan that will change their mind next week, and you'll upset somebody else? You're not going to please everybody. So he just thought it was best for what was best for the characters, how he put them together, how they were created, how were they crafted. And Stan, again, great wordsmith. He put things together well, but he wanted to, put out a story, come up with something exciting and fun for the kids. He knew they liked guest stars. He knew they liked all these other things, but to Ditko, it just, didn't make a lot of sense. And I think he followed that through as much as he could at that point.
You talk about his intentionality as a creator, and of course, anybody that's creating something really wants to make it into something and give it their best. But was there anything kind of intentionally personal for Steve Ditko in Spider-Man that he felt like he needed to really go to bat for it and for his ideas? Like, was there just something about that particular character that meant a lot to Ditko other than the popularity of it?
I don't know. I think, again, with everything he's done, he probably takes it very seriously and invests a lot in what he's doing. I don't know how much the character of Peter Parker is involved with him personally. Obviously, everybody takes things from their life's experiences as they've grown up as kids, what they've done, how they've lived, what they've dealt with over their lives. I think a lot of it, even subconsciously, is brought in. And I think that added to the intensity of the character, the realism of the character. I mean, that was probably, I grew up in that time period. I always make jokes that I was on the cusp of Ditko's work, because the first Spider-Man I remember is Amazing Spider-Man number 39, with John Romita's the cover and the beautiful colors jumping out at the newsstand. I love the coloring, the blues and the purples, and I think Stan Goldberg colored that. I told him once, is that cover just jumped out of the newsstands. But at the same time, I was reading Marvel Tales. My older brother John, had the earlier comics, starting with Amazing Spider-Man number 3, and Ditko just drew me in completely. Even though I loved Romita's stuff, there was something about it, the way he drew characters, the figures, the way he drew people and clothing. It looked like a real person. He was able to do that very, very well, and the emotions that came through on the character of Peter Parker was and the other characters there had a feeling of truth to it, and you didn't get that too much in too many comic books, but especially at that period, and I think that was just the way he dealt with things, Doctor Strange was a very different character, but he follows a lot of the tenets of Ditko. He was a loner. He worked individually on his own, saving the world without anyone knowing what he was doing. And he lived in his own, intense little world, So I think, that was just as intense in its own way, even though, it didn't have the core of characters that Peter Parker had and Spider-Man had with the characters, probably one of the biggest cast in that period. I mean, any other book you compare it to, it's who had all these teenage characters, the Bugle, Betty, Aunt May, not even in Fantastic Four. You had a cast of characters that would pop up, but nothing that huge. So, I think he really, once he was doing it, at that moment, he probably was really, really involved in doing the best he could with that and really putting a lot into it.
Now, Nick, one thing that Dan and I have talked about a lot over the course of this season, it's kind of interesting when you go back and look at Peter Parker through the Ditko Lee era he's as a character he's filled with contradictions. On one end, the core mantra with great power comes great responsibility kind of indicates this obligation to do what's right, even if it comes at great sacrifice or great, even if it seems inconvenient, he'd rather be doing something else. Yet at the same token, there's certainly a lot of moments, especially when he's more Peter rather than Spider-Man, where there's kind of this hubris to the character of I'm not a superiority, but how would you describe it, Dan? There's an edge to the character that I think probably comes from Ditko's beliefs, right? Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, he kind of. I mean, we've talked about how there seemed to be a clear path for Peter to become a villain, which is obviously tied up in his origin story, the kind of selfishness that he expresses in the very kind of insular world that he's creating for himself, that allows him to kind of create his own morals that kind of clashes with reality, where the world doesn't really care about what you think, or what you deem as good. And I don't know I don't want to jump on your question, Mark, but to me, the interesting thing about it is it seems like a very non-objectivist point of view, but then some of Ditko's, what I imagine are Ditko's beliefs, seem to creep in at the edges of that every now and again.
Yeah, I think a lot of that aspect of it probably came from Stan. I think the aspect that Ditko put through it, I don't think he ever... First of all, it was a kid growing up, teenager growing up, and I thought that was a very, big thing because he has, most of the time I think it's been said that he's, if you're a kid, you're still learning, When you're adult, you should be acting like an adult, be responsible, know what you're doing. As a kid, he could make mistakes. And I think Ditko has said that, it's a kid. He's a teenager. He's learning. He's going to make mistakes. He made mistakes, in certain issues, certain stories, and he learned from them. Or sometimes it took him a while to learn from them. But the other aspect of it is that it's the loner aspect that Ditko has done a lot in his stories. Here he is doing the right thing. And how many times did you have the people against him, the Bugle against him? He was alone by himself because nobody understood that he was doing the right things. So you had that loner individual that was isolated from society because he was doing the right things. And I think a lot of that came from Ditko. And you saw that a lot throughout his run. At some point, Dan, you and I are going to talk we're going to dedicate a whole episode of this season to the mystery of the Green Goblin and kind of its impact on Spider-Man and comics in general. But to kind of tie it in here also about Steve Ditko, Nick, one of the most fascinating things for me in when I was doing research for my book was kind of how this myth perpetuated itself that, well, first of all, that Ditko, the source of the breakup between Ditko and Lee was the Green Goblin story, which right.
But then also this idea that Ditko never wanted it to be a somebody, that he wanted the character to be revealed as a nobody or something, kind of similar to what he did with the Crime Master a few issues earlier. And I know Ditko has written a lot about this, kind of like, where does this come from? You obviously have, you've read a lot of the same essays, and you have your own perspectives on this. Where did this come from? Why where is this myth come from in your idea?
Unfortunately, I think it's come from Stan Lee mostly, because that storyline came out when he was probably asked many years ago of a disagreement, and he either didn't recall, didn't want to bring up bad feelings, and he probably misremembered something, because I think this is probably going back many issues where he was thinking of another character when they were talking to each other and disagreed on something. It could even go back as far as Electro, because if you look at that story, at the end of that story, he was a nobody. And maybe that's something that occurred at other times. But with the Green Goblin, since that story has been perpetuated, and Ditko has said from day one, he's shown, that he came up with the idea not to have him as a nobody. I've also uncovered in one of my blog posts a fanzine interview with John Romita from 1966 when he just came back, and in the interview it says, we had to make him Norman Osborn. He says, the way Ditko plotted the stories, we had no choice. Stan had no choice. So later on, Romita forgot that, which is understandable. He was busy with other stuff. He didn't know the details. But he said that back when he was doing the first few issues. That says a lot. And if you look through the stories, and Ditko's pointed this out, that here's this character that's showing up little by little, always in the background scenes. Then he starts speaking. Lee gave him the name Norman Osborn. But no, he wanted him. That was a mystery. It was an ongoing mystery that he would have resolved eventually if he had stood on. And even in those last issues, you see Norman Osborn as a sinister character. I don't think that was deliberate. If he had stayed on, he might have resolved it himself. It would have been different, obviously, from what Stan did, but he definitely would have, done that. The Crime Master story, again, his contention is, why would I want another mystery villain? This guy wasn't going to be. He was a thug. He was a mob boss, but he covered his face, but it was no mystery. He didn't look at it that way. Why would I do it again? So it makes sense. It's one of my favorite stories, too, the two-part Crime Master story. As you mentioned in the earlier post, the mobsters, the film noir type storyline, cops, robbers. It was really, really entertaining, and you didn't need the super menaces to make it interesting.
And, the other story I wanted to ask you about specifically, and you wrote a blog post about this one, and I mean, it's an obvious choice if you're talking about the Ditko Lee run, but of course the Master Planner trilogy and specifically the final chapter. Now, one of the things that you mentioned in your blog post about this was like, this for all intents and purposes was kind of the finale of Ditko's run, even if there were 5 more issues after this.
True, yeah, yeah.
So, what do you think that? Because it is. I mean, Dan and I have talked about this a few times during the course of the season. Like, it's don't get us wrong. This is a brilliant run of comics, but those last 5 issues just really do feel like just kind of a random tacked on thing. So, what's your sense of why so much seemed to culminate there, and then there was just kind of this little afterthought afterwards? I mean, was Ditko ready to hang it up after 33, or what's your take on this?
I don't know. That's a good question. I really don't know what his thought processes were there. It did seem like it was the topper. I mean, it was really hard to beat. I mean, you really were on the top of your game. How do you top that? It is really hard. I don't know if he intended to leave at that point, or if he stood on for whatever reasons. I don't know. I really don't. But those 3 issues, especially 33, just really built up to a crescendo. And, there really wasn't, maybe he felt at that point that was, as far as he could go with that. And, he did, a few things here and there after that with the character, but it was kind of hard to top. Really, it is one of those stories that really, hold up. And, I don't know how much what his thought process there was, if he intended to stay long or if he thought about it later on. I don't know, but maybe some of the wind went out of the sails at that point, and it was just coasting a little bit at that point. I don't know.
Whenever people talk about Steve Ditko and his work, objectivism always seems to be the word that's in the other hand. Right, like there's no mentioning him without mentioning this one thing, and I'm curious. Right. I'm curious why you feel that is. When we have writers and artists like Mark Millar and Frank Miller and Alan Moore who wear their politics on their sleeves as much as Ditko, maybe even more than Ditko, especially in regards to Ditko's Spider-Man work, where I think you could probably not pick up on it if you didn't have a trained eye looking for it. Why do you feel like Ditko has been so... It's almost as if he's been like tarred and feathered with this word objectivism, where people kind of use it as almost like an attack. Why do you think that that's become such a kind of like a word that's so tied to him? Is it just like Mr. A and all this stuff? Or I'm curious about your opinion on that.
I just... I don't know. I suspect part of the problem is that he went in a different direction than most anybody else did in that period. I mean, he really was, his thought processes and his storytelling and the objectivism itself was not something that was very appealing to a lot of the fan base. And the fact that he did things his own way, did not, go along with the crowd, bothered a lot of people. And I think that's a part of the objections, and that he wasn't doing Spider-Man anymore. That he wasn't going back and had no intention of going back to do what they loved, the fans loved. And to him, maybe he was intense with it at that point, but he moved on, and he always, he may have not felt that he couldn't go back and redo it again. There was so much. Don't forget, if you took that character so seriously, you're going to go back after 5 years, 10 years with all these other storylines and plots and developments, a lot of which you probably would never have approved of. Would he really go back and want to do that again? That's what he heard over and over again. People were not, some fans were, but a lot of fans were not interested in Mr. A, or didn't like it, didn't like the Charlton work he was doing, which some of it was really, really nice and incredibly work in the late 60s, early 70s that I've written about. And he invested a lot of work in the war and stuff, and a lot of his own creations and characters. And, a lot of it was overlooked. And I think a part of it is the unhappiness with him not returning to the same old stuff, to going back to Doctor Strange or Spider-Man. And the fact that, how do you top yourself? It's... in any venue, it's hard. It's hard to go back and, you're going to go back and do, top yourself, do a better job. You're always going to be compared to what you did before. It's not easy. And I think he realized that, too.
Do you think if he was a little more open with the fans or the public or anything? Yeah, I mean, Dan was talking about objectivism being on one hand. I mean, I think the other statement, you will, that always gets tied to Steve Ditko is he's reclusive. He won't give interviews. He doesn't make public appearances. I mean, does that kind of like create this dark cloud, if you will, over him? I mean, obviously we're not fairly, but because he does seem to engage with people, but it seems to be on his terms. And do you think that is does that rub people?
Well, I think the perception is that because we read about this over and over and over again, that he's this reclusive person that doesn't talk to anybody, doesn't communicate with anybody. He's alone, he's bitter, and you have all these other storylines that come out over and over again, the people that don't even know about the guy. Again, he does it on his terms. The man is not a celebrity, doesn't want to be a celebrity, doesn't want to be interviewed, but he's a man of letters. He writes to people all the time. People have gone to see him. He's spoke to them. A lot of people I've talked to have communicated with him, met him. People that have met him at the not at conventions, that have met him at Marvel or DC, or when he was dropping off things. Pleasant guy that they could talk to. He had a lot of other experiences that are totally different, that he engaged with people. So I think it's this myth that comes out a lot of times from people that have no clue as to what he is like. Yes, he's a private person. He respects that he wants that privacy to be there, but he doesn't think it matters. That's important to anybody else in that respect. And then he hears all these other rumors and innuendos and other things that are completely untrue. So, it would upset any of us, Somebody just comes and knocks on your door, which I've heard many times, and shows up in front of your house. Most people are not going to be happy about it, and they've done that to him many times, So, we don't know what he experiences, but I get a clue that, some of that is really, really disruptive, rude. And he comes from a time period where, you didn't do those things, and he was just an artist sitting around like anybody else doing their work. And he was not a rock star or a celebrity.
Now you have an ongoing conversation with him going on. What's that like? How did that get started?
I just decided to write a letter one day, about 10 years ago. And so on, I said, I've never written to him. I'm friends with this publisher, Robin Stein, a really great person. And, I've written to him. We've talked about different things over the years. He's a guy that Steve trusts very much, and they have a great relationship together. And I just decided one day, let me write and just tell him, how I appreciate his work and, talk about general things about comics and stuff. And, back and forth. We've had many letters back and forth. What goes with Ditko stays with Ditko. So those things are not coming out. I am not going to be like these people that come out and here's my letter published. That's private stuff. And I'm very pleased that he's, that you can have a conversation, write to him. And he's a very thoughtful and generous person in that regard. I think he's written to many people over the years, even people that have just asked for things that he's not going to give them, but he still replies to them. So, that says a lot about his character. People forget that he was one of the main artists in the early 60s that contributed to fanzines prolifically. Most of the characters he gave away, the Mr. A stories and Avenging World, he basically gave to the fanzines to publish for free. People stole from him. There's artwork that was never returned. For being a nice guy. And he drew and he contributed to many, many fanzines and to people that were fan writers and artists that wanted advice, that went up and spoke to him. So there's another portrayal of him that I get that is not always out there.
Nick, is there anything that you feel like is most misunderstood or has gone unsaid about Steve Ditko?
There's been a lot said about Ditko and his work. I just think he's been in the business for about 6 decades. He's going to be 90 soon. He's still writing and drawing and creating ideas and concepts. And, the fact that he's been in this business for so long, has done so much work in so many different genres, been so inventive over the years. He is one of my favorite creative artists out there. I liked his work when I was a kid, and I continue to learn more about it, learn more about his work, what he's done, and I'm, to be able to discover that and see something new many times when I look through this stuff. That I think that's a huge thing, and I think he's one of the the great creative talents in comic books. To be honest with you.
Perfect. Well,
Thanks.
We want to thank you for coming on our show.
Well, I appreciate that. It's been a really exciting, interesting conversation. You guys, asked good questions, kept me on my toes, and you didn't not the same old stuff. Which is, like I said, I listened to your last post, and I could see you guys knew a lot about Spider-Man and about comics and Ditko, and you don't always get that. So I really appreciate that you delve into it.
Well, thank you
Excellent.
for coming on. This means a lot that you would take some time out of your day to join us. Well, thanks again for Nick Caputo for joining us on the show. It was a blast to have him. But next up, we've got Ron Frenz. I'm always happy to introduce. And Ron, of course, is famous for his work on Amazing Spider-Man, starting with issue 252. His work on Spider-Girl, that epically long running series, and also for his famous work on Thor, which all of it you can find on Marvel Unlimited, and it's just a blast to read through and look at. So let's welcome Ron Frenz back to the show.
Well, now let's meet one of our amazing spider friends. The kind of guy I go to other friends who recommend. Find out about the things they created. You'll love them so much that you wish you dated. But you're just friends, they're an amazing friend. A friend, a friend, a friend. They're an amazing friend.
Welcome back, listeners. We are back to talk more about Steve Ditko, but this time we've got a little bit of a different viewpoint to talk about, and that viewpoint is going to be provided by none other than our longtime friend of the show, Ron Frenz. Welcome back to the show, Ron.
Why, thank you very much, Dan. It's great to be here. Hi, Mark. How are you tonight?
Oh, I'm fantastic. Thanks so much for coming along, Ron. We really look forward to talking to you.
Always my pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Well, tonight we're going to be talking about Steve Ditko from, I guess, an artistic point of view. Ron, when I first talked to you, let's just say a few years ago, which actually kind of was, weirdly enough.
Let's just say before. Yeah,
yes.
Just before.
Before. That sounds good. You had mentioned Steve Ditko as a major influence on your work on Amazing Spider-Man. For those who don't know, Ron worked, starting with issue 252 alongside Tom DeFalco as the writer. And you had mentioned he was a big influence on your work. And I think that's pretty obvious to anybody that would, read your comics, whether it's how you used your panels or how you drew the characters. And I guess we wanted to have you on to kind of delve a little bit deeper into what you appreciate about Steve Ditko's work on the character.
Okay. If you want an artist point of view, we may have to find an artist. But as a journeyman illustrator, Mr. Ditko, I would consider an artist. Because the art is in the viewing, to my mind a lot, and there are things that he is able to do and to get away with. It's certainly a very unique approach, and I would venture to say, I've only met the man once, very briefly. I was at Marvel visiting. I had just started Spider-Man, and I was good friends with still, where we haven't spoken in decades, but I was friends with Jo Duffy, and she was Archie Goodwin's assistant on the Epic line. So I was hanging out in their office, killing some time at the Marvel offices, and Steve Ditko was doing a backup in the Coyote book, and I don't remember, was it called The Djinn or something like that? I don't know, you comic experts, does that ring a bell at all?
That does sound familiar.
So don't quote me on what strip it was, but he was doing a backup strip for Coyote. So he came into the office, and Archie Goodwin took great glee in saying, Ron Frenz, this is Steve Ditko. And I went, hello, sir. And I shook his hand, and he was very pleasant and very accommodating. But then Archie, being Archie, God love him, he says, they're making him do you on Spider-Man. and Mr. Ditko just turned to me and said, shame on them. And I said, well, they're not making me, but, and that blah, 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 that kind of thing. And then he went on to discuss business with Archie and, said it was nice meeting you. And it all lasted just a few minutes, and I was a little taken aback. And it wasn't until afterwards, I wasn't even aware of the mystique, because I told people, I got to meet Steve Ditko. What's he look like? And all this stuff. Does he look like Mr. A? And all this jazz. And I had no idea of, no real clue of the mystique that had built up around Mr. Ditko. And, I was familiar with his work at Charlton and the Creepers, one of those characters that just has always appealed to me. And of course on Spider-Man. And so, he is truly unique in his approach and in his and what of himself he puts into his work, in my belief. But I would say the thing that I discovered by studying his work by poring over his early run of Spider-Man, and in anticipation of handling the character on a regular basis, is the deceptive simplicity and clarity of his storytelling. It is a masterclass in putting the information needed to move the story along in the panels as clearly as possible, that's the job. I mean, that's pretty much it. You have to be able to draw things. You have to be able to use reference when you need it and all of that, and do it by a deadline. But the real job description is telling the story in pictures as clearly as possible. And I'm not sure anybody ever did it as well as Steve Ditko. I even include Jack Kirby in that, because he always picked the shot. He never struck me as being more concerned with dazzling the reader as he was with telling the story clearly. People have talked about how he didn't draw glamorous people. He was the anti-Ramita, and he didn't believe in glamour. He believed in showing people in all their humanity and frailty, and he did less than beautiful women and less than handsome, glamorous men. But I think that is one of the things that appealed to Stan Lee when it came to Spider-Man. I think that's what he was going for, of course. The legend being that he thought about taking it to Jack, but Jack made him too heroic, and it was too much of a traditional view of a superhero, and that's not what Stan was looking for. So all of that is there, but I mean, it really is a situation where, like, the 9-panel grid that he's kind of known for is storytelling at its best. It's not trying to impress you with crazy panel layouts and all that. Some of that would come later in his other work, and certainly in the Creeper and things like that. But on Spider-Man, he was interested in you getting involved in the characters. He was most interested in telling the story about the characters, and you relating to Peter Parker and relating to this cast of supporting characters that looked like people that you would meet and that you could be friends with. And it was, it was really just amazing looking at the work and realizing that the biggest mistake you could make with storytelling is overthinking it. I mean, when I first broke in, I had been a fan for years, and had taken in a lot of storytelling techniques by osmosis type of thing. But when I was first drawing for Marvel, I was working in my parents' home. I was still at home with them, and I would show the stuff to my mom. I mean, she was a civilian, she was untrained in comic storytelling, and if she could tell me what was going on in general terms, like, oh, this guy is angry at something this guy said, and oh, now he's storming out and slamming the door, and oh, and there's Spider-Man, and he's swinging over the city, and it looks like he just saw something. And, if she could tell me what was going on, then I knew I was doing my job, because that's the job. Once I started studying, a couple of years in, once I started looking at Ditko, it just was amazing how good he was at that. What a natural storyteller he is.
Well, we always comment that Amazing Fantasy 15 is only 11 pages to get across the whole origin of the character.
Right.
And it's remarkable how efficient it is.
Well, I mean, it's been something in the last several years that, when there's filler needed, we just did that Spider-Girl series that ran in Spider Island during the last Secret Wars thing, the overarching Secret Wars thing, and they always contact Tom DeFalco because there are writers who can't even conceive of doing a 5-page story or a 10-page story and getting anything done in it. Tom DeFalco tells a story about talking to an editor where the guy was hiring him. It was either a 10-page story or a 5-page story, and the guy kept talking about, and I understand the problem, and he kept talking about the problem, and Tom was going, what hasn't he told me yet? What's the problem? And he finally, was able to get a word in edgewise, and he said, excuse me, what's the problem you keep referring to? Well, the fact that it's only these many pages. And Tom said, that's not a problem. That's the requirement. Well, do you think you can do it? I said, of course I can do it. It is something. It's one of the things that's been lost, I think, along with the craft as comics have become an art form. I think it's one of the basic requirements of a craft that have been, in some ways, by some people forgotten. But yeah, I mean, you should be able to, whether it takes 9 panels a page or not. I mean, you should be able to tell the story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and as many pages as you have to tell the story. And of course, coming off of the anthologies, they were doing that all the time. They were telling wonderful little O. Henry, Rod Serling type stories in 5 pages and 8 pages and things like that. That was the standard of the time. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. But it really is the clarity. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people look at Ditko and don't think he's flashy, and they see the quirkiness of some of the figures and they see the quirkiness of some of the expressions, but they don't think he's complicated or he's or maybe there are people that study him voraciously and are reading a lot of things into it and all this, but the clarity of the storytelling is very basic and very clean and very clear, and you can look at a page of Ditko art and you can tell what the heck is going on, and as I said, that's the job. So
now, Ron, obviously, many artists have been influenced by Ditko and cite him as an inspiration. Yet, at the same time, as you've kind of duly noted, he definitely had his own style that has never truly been replicated. And I was hoping you can kind of verbalize for us, first of all, what made Ditko's art, specifically on Spider-Man, so distinct, and just in terms of how the figures he drew and what kind of set it apart, but also I guess what does it mean that this really we haven't really had that style since? I mean, is that more reflective on the trends of the industry, or are people looking for something flashier? I mean, do you think Ditko doing Spider-Man today, would it work? You know what I mean? Would it be popular? I guess that's kind of where I'm going with that.
I have a tendency to think it does. I think all of the greats, Mr. Kirby and Mr. Eisner and Mr. Ditko, they have the status of being unique. I mean, they are a product of who they are. Their work is inseparable from who they were as a person and their upbringing and their backgrounds and everything that they bring to the table. That's what true artists do. Craftsmen are something different, journeymen are something different, but artists are bringing something, very unique to themselves to the table. And I certainly would include, Ditko in that definition. So it's very hard. I mean, his point of view was so unique. Just like with Kirby, you can do the affectations. You can have art, have his art in front of you, and you can, do the gestures, and you can do the 9-panel grid, and and it's the same way with Kirby. You can do a double-page splash, and you can overwork the tech, and but it's only the the veneer. It's only the glamour. I mean, I've never. I've benefited from what I could learn as far as storytelling and dynamics from these incredible people, but I have no illusions that my work in any way has given me an insight into their genius. And I know genius is a word that gets overused these days, but I honestly believe that when you're talking about the Eisners and the Kirbys and the Ditkos, we're talking about genius. We're talking about people who brought something completely unique. They were completely unique individuals who brought something completely unique to the medium they were working in. So I wish I could give you a more definitive answer, Mark. The thing about the figures is, again, he worked against. And one of the reasons I'm not sure it would work now, and one of the reasons why there are certain people that I bet you, like a Mike Allred, cites Ditko as an influence. Would that be fair? Have you ever interviewed Mr. Allred?
We have not, but okay. I think that
I would venture to say he probably is somebody who would, without over-flattering him, would be considered almost like a modern-day Ditko. He has a very unique approach. He tends to not entertain the tropes. He doesn't worry about the glamour of the superhero figure as much, and things like that. And that was something that Ditko brought to the fore. I mean, and because Kirby became such the standard. There were gentlemen who were working in comics doing crime stories and doing romance stories and all this, and when superheroes hit it big in that second wave with Marvel in the 60s, they came to Marvel. Guys like Don Heck, let's say, fantastic illustrator, did crime stories and horror stories and things like that. And when it came to doing superheroes, he was finding his way. And at Marvel, what did that mean? Look at Kirby. Either Jack was doing layouts for them, or they were being asked to crib Kirby, and that was the basis of a lot of people's superhero experience at the time. And at Marvel, John Buscema cites that, Sal Buscema cites that. Heck talks about it. That's the root of their superhero approach was always Jack Kirby. And Ditko was kind of the anti-Kirby. He was what makes the Spider-Man figure unique, not just when he's swinging and being spidery, but when he's just standing there, the body's more relaxed. The hip is cocked, the one knee is bent. The hips are on an angle, the shoulders are on an angle. He stood like a person in a costume. And at the time, that's what Stan was looking for. That was the, quote unquote radical approach to superheroes that he was looking for at the time. And even as Spider-Man's musculature developed, it was still there. It was still the same thing, and it's still what made Spider-Man unique. When I was lucky enough to do the Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, that's what it was about Ditko that I wanted to try to bring to the party, because it was Spider-Man standing in a room talking about his history with this young boy, and I needed Spider-Man standing in that room to look like Spider-Man. And, when push comes to shove, and believe me, nobody's a bigger Romita fan than I am, but when push comes to shove was, what makes Spider-Man standing next to, say, a Kurt Swan Superman is Ditko. And I, like I said, no disrespect to any of the fine artists that have done Spider-Man over the years. Certainly not to Mr. Romita, but that's just the thing. That's kind of the thing. And, when you talk about what an influence he was on me, he was. I mean, I learned so much about storytelling from paying attention to Mr. Ditko, but it also was, uniquely Spider-Man that he was an influence on. When I was awarded the Thor series, I studied Kirby out the wazoo, to get familiar with what makes each of those characters uniquely themselves. And, so it was Ditko for Spider-Man, Thor, it was Kirby, and so on and so forth. But, with every character I've ever really been associated with for more than, a moment, a passing moment. So, but if you asked me if I was going to do the Vision, I would be looking at John Buscema. Mm. You go back to the root of whatever the character happens to be. So, did I even come close to answering your question, Mark?
Of course.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, Ron, about the stance, because it's hard, I think, for like lay people like ourselves. Maybe we're not lay people after 200 episodes of Spider-Man conversations, but as a non-artist, it's hard to put the finger on what it is that makes a contribution so unique. So that's why I loved hearing you say that about Ditko and how he positioned the character.
Oh, absolutely. And Peter, there is a thing, and I was paying attention, as I said, to the veneer. I mean, one of the nicest things that's ever been said about me ever was, Mark would not be aware of this because he doesn't collect the annuals. But that annual that I did, the Amazing Spider-Man annual I did, where Jonah Jameson got married, was plotted by Tom DeFalco, but it was scripted by Stan Lee. And this was back before email and everything, and people being copied on emails, but Danny Finkeroth was nice enough to send me a letter that he got from Stan, a memo that he got from Stan. And there was like a paragraph in there where, it was talking about business and getting pages and when he would have the script complete and all this kind of stuff. And he said, and speaking of the pages, this Ron Frenz guy is terrific, that kind of thing. And he was noticing that I was studying Ditko, and he was very flattering about the storytelling, and he was very flattering about how I was laying out panels to lead the eye, and all this kind of stuff. And it was wonderful. It was one of those moments, and I've had one or two in my career because I'm the luckiest guy you're ever going to meet. But it was one of those moments that makes you think, maybe I could have cut the mustard back in the day. Maybe I could have actually apprenticed with some of these guys and contributed. To have Stan flatter me that way. But it was definitely, at that point, it was early in my run on Spider-Man, and I was still very, very much paying attention to Ditko in the positioning of the character and the layout of the panels and how people were carrying themselves, how a cop walked across the room and all this kind of stuff. And those are the things that the affectations of Ditko that you can recreate, that you can do. You can do the fingers, you can do the Doctor Strange Spider-Man web shooting fingers. You can draw people's earlobes like Ditko did. You could, have pants draped the way Ditko would draw them, and you can do all of that. You can do the veneer, and you can approximate on some level the staging and the storytelling. But what really makes Ditko is the gentleman himself. I mean, is whatever's going on in that incredible brain of his. The same with Mr. Kirby. I mean, Mark Evanier, I enjoy reading his essays about Jack because, he worked with the guy. He has no idea. I mean, the guy was just amazing. Ideas just came out of him like Kirby dots. I mean, that's just who these people are. They are unique creative forces that we're fortunate enough to have here for however long they'll share it with us.
Now, Ron, you're obviously fortunate to have worked with writers, co-creators that you have had a very good working relationship with. I'm of course thinking of the legendary Tom DeFalco, who anytime I've talked to him about something, he makes sure to give you ample credit for your contributions. now, obviously, part of the mythology, if you will, with Stan Lee and Steve Ditko is this, and obviously Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and a lot of the early artists in comic books and period is this idea of artistic rights and creator rights, and
Right.
and Ditko, more than I think even Kirby, kind of put himself more forward in that regard in terms of getting more credit. I think Kirby later on pushed for it, but Ditko, like when he was working on Spider-Man, he pushed to get like a co-plotter credit. And I'm curious, you young up-and-coming artists, breaking in. I mean, did Ditko's kind of actions in that regard, did that pave a way for you at all? Or, I mean, did that really come?
On some level it did. I'm sure on some level it did. Mostly just on the level, though, that at Marvel, because of the way Stan worked, and because of the fact that he was working with guys who were master storytellers like Ditko and like Mr. Kirby, that became known as the Marvel style. So by the time I got there, that was a thing, and it was it's a hugely collaborative effort. I mean, it depends on who the writer is and who the personalities are as to how much credit you're going to get on the page. But, I mean, as a fan, I was very aware of the collaborative nature of comics and how, certain writers and artists really seem to mesh and other teams not so much and things like that. So, it was something that I was looking forward to and have enjoyed with, Bruce Jones on K-Star, he was the writer. I would get his scripts. They weren't full scripts. They were little short stories. And that's how they were structured. And I would sit down and I would break them down. And in its own way, that was an amazing exercise in me breaking a story down visually. Joe Duffy and I collaborated a lot. We would talk about, in the same way that Tom DeFalco and I made a very regular thing of, we would talk about the characters. And from those conversations, we would make sure we were on the same page with who these characters were and how they interacted. And so there, we would make sure that we had a consistent language, that we both knew what the other one was talking about verbally and visually. So, that kind of collaboration is necessary. Having worked together, somebody just asked me a question the other day. I was doing an interview for a local tabloid, and somebody was asking about ideas specifically that I contributed to my run on Thor. And genuinely, I don't remember. I mean, there are certain things I remember having been a fan turned pro. There are certain moments I remember that specifically that were like the first time I contributed a story element or the first time I put in a liner note that got used by the writer or, and little moments, little minor epiphanies like that along the way. But, to ask, off, like, that there's like this one idea that you don't have time for that. Especially in my collaboration with Tom DeFalco. I mean, it's really hard to pull that thread and say who came up with what, because we might both have a legitimate claim that, we both came at that idea and got there at the same time from different directions. Yeah, that's happened more than once. It's happened dozens and dozens of times, too many to count. And so when I read, these condemnations of Stan Lee because he was taking credit for other people's work and everything, it's just not that simple. It's just not. I mean, yes, and when you look at old memos, and I was on one website and I saw letters that were written by. Help me, Gentleman Flo. Fabulous Flo Steinberg, was it?
Yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Dan's secretary. There were these wonderful letters that you would write to fans And in those letters, she would talk openly, and these were CC'd to Stan, and he would sign off on them, but they were talking openly with the fans about the fact that Jack told the stories and mailed the pages in, and Stan scripted them. So this myth that Stan was out there, taking credit for everything is just that. It's a myth. That I can't tell you how many times I've done interviews where I talk extensively about Tom DeFalco or Joe Duffy or whoever the writer is or whatever, and the article does not mention them at all. I mean, at my alma mater, they put up a display case one time that gave me credit for creating Star Wars. Because it comes down to, the terminology. My latest creation is Star Wars. Boy, I wish. Or my latest creation is Kesar the Savage. I didn't create Kesar the Savage, So, I'm sure there was a lot of that going on. I mean, when, just to name drop for a second, when Pat Olive and I shared studio space, we had both been burned time and time again by articles that would say, series when they meant issue, or say create when they meant pencil, things like that, and would misspell, because you would refer to Kirby or Buscema or something, and they would butcher the spelling of Buscema because they couldn't be bothered to look it up. Sometimes it was pre-Google, many times post-Google, and it would just frustrate the crap out of us. And at one point we did an interview, and I forget what it was all about, but we had done an interview, and I was on the phone with the person who had done the interview, and they were double-checking a couple of things and blah, blah, blah. And Pat and I had discussed it, so I said, listen, when you have the copy together, would you mind sending it to us so we could just proof it? And our only intention was to avoid those kinds of things that I just, mentioned. And the writer was so offended that the article never happened. And, so that just goes on in this industry all the time. And I can't help but think that it was more that and less Stan trying to take credit. There's a famous recorded interview with them that was done for the radio or something, and just because of the personality in the two gentlemen, Stan talked more than Jack did. Whose fault is that? I do interviews with Tom DeFalco. At one point, we were doing a podcast interview at the same time, and he was barely talking at all. And I said, people are going to think I have you locked in my basement or something.
Do you?
It was starting to make me uncomfortable. Well, that's the thing, because Tom's response was, "Oh, you're going to let me out?" That kind of thing. So there is so much to the collaboration between Craftsman A and Craftsman B that when people who are not in the know are so sure, I despair, because you can't tell them they're wrong, but I would never venture a guess about the relationship between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The one thing Tom DeFalco says is every time he saw them together, there was a genuine affection. He never saw them interact where he didn't feel there was genuine affection between the two gentlemen.
Well, there's also a desire to kind of mythologize these stories, like Stan Lee and Steve Ditko being kind of like antagonistic towards each other, and I'm sure some of it is real, but you also want to create like a sexier story, so you pit these two people against each other. I'm absolutely sure some of it is real. Yeah. I'm absolutely sure some of it is real, because when I met Stan Lee, he claims to not know absolutely for sure to this day why Steve just up and quit. Yeah.
And apparently Mr. Ditko's comment has always been Stan knows. But apparently Stan doesn't. because Mr. Lee said that to me when I was sitting across from him. He said, "I don't know what happened." Now, he had no reason to like get into the weeds with me on this thing. I'm just a schmo from Pittsburgh, but he genuinely didn't seem to really know what the deal was.
Ron, it's perfectly clear you are the one who knows of everyone.
I was saying just the opposite.
You're their secret keeper.
But there is really, an amazing, because it really does become a situation where, it's almost impossible for people that weren't there. I mean, it really bothers me from the stories you hear. It bothers me that Stan Lee, for a lot of people, is akin to the stories you hear about Bob Kane, who really was campaigning constantly to be the only person to get credit for Batman.
Yeah.
And finally, Bill Finger has been recognized, and the contributions of Jerry Robinson, and so on and so forth. But I don't think those are the same things. I just don't. I don't think there's a commonality between a Stan Lee and what went on all those years with his collaborators and a Bob Kane. I just don't. And maybe history will prove me incorrect. I don't know. But having spent 30 some odd years in this business collaborating with people, and being very free with contributions and everything, I'm gratified when an idea of mine is taken to fruition and sees the page and gets out to the fans and is appreciated, certainly, and that's terrific. I mean, the alchemy of this two-dimensional storytelling medium is after all these years is still so fascinating to me. It's incredible that you can take flat images and you can put word balloons over their heads, and you can throw some color on it, and you can put it on a page, and you can put a couple of staples in it, and you can send it out, and you can elicit an emotional response. Is amazing to me. It's magic. And it's, and when you can do that, when you can make somebody feel something about a two-dimensional image, it's incredibly gratifying. It is the reward of storytelling, of making somebody feel something. That's incredible.
Well, Ron, that's beautiful and all, but when you met Steve Ditko, did he look like Mr. A?
Actually, it looked like the question. I don't remember what he looked like. I have some pictures of him in my, on my laptop and everything for inspiration, and I'm going to say that's what he looked like. But, I wish I'd paid more attention. What can I tell you? He wasn't wearing a hat like Mr. A, that kind of thing. So I don't know. I do believe he was wearing a shirt and tie and a sport jacket, though.
Well, there you go.
So,
real insight.
Yeah, I mean, well, all those guys were, were real pros, though. I mean, it was always, Pat Olive, God love him, he would always sit there and look at pictures of, like, Bill Everett, with a shirt and tie or with his shirt open, and, where they would wear, slacks and a work shirt over the board and all this kind of stuff. And just, wow, they were guys. They were, that looks professional, that kind of thing. And I can't disagree. I mean, there's a romance to it that when you're lucky enough to be involved in this industry, there's definitely a romance to be recognized in those who have come before, who really, blazed the trails.
Well, Ron, I knew having you on would provide a ton of insight, and I think you totally delivered, despite the fact that you might not believe that.
Oh, well, glad to hear that. I don't even remember what I said. I hope somebody was taking notes or recording it or something, because I couldn't repeat it if you tried.
All right. Well, it will live in this recording forever. So you can listen back and see just how bright of a star you were at the time.
Wow, my goodness. I am humbled, and that's the biggest thing is, I honestly do feel like the luckiest guy in the world that, from the time I was 7 or 8 and you asked me what I wanted to do, it was to grow up and work for Marvel Comics and draw Spider-Man. And when I was 25, I was doing it. And how many people can say that? It's an amazing thing. And all these years later, I'm content. I have friends of mine who are struggling with aging and talking about, are you happy and everything? And I said, happy is something you're at a birthday party. You're happy. Happy is something you're on a roller coaster. You're happy or not. But if I know where my next check is coming from and I have some work to keep me busy and I know my rent's going to get paid, I am content. So, and this industry has given me that.
Thanks again for joining us for the 9th episode of our first season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. Dan, next episode, 2 weeks, November 15th. What's the title of that show?
Yeah, we're actually going to get this one out in 2 weeks. Sorry for the delay this week. Our next show is going to be called Spider-Man's Origins Remixed. Remix! Yeah, we're going to be talking about the many different times that Spider-Man's origins have been redone and altered, whether it's straight up rebooting the whole thing, adding in additional wrinkles to his remix that weren't previously there. We're going to be taking a look at it all starting in 2 weeks.
Yeah, kids, that means Chapter 1's on the horizon. Woo!
All right, I'm looking forward to it.
Everybody is looking forward to Chapter 1, Dan.
Are they?
Maybe. Also, for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast feed for this week's bonus episodes. Last week, Dan and I reviewed Amazing Spider-Man 789, the beginning of Marvel's legacy run on Amazing Spider-Man. This time around, we're going to be getting to an episode about Amazing Spider-Man number 790 as Spidey battles the Human Torch again over the mix-up of the Baxter Building. And we also have a double bonus episode, an interview with our good friend Ron Frenz about his Facebook and social media presence, which was a lot of fun, Dan.
Yeah. Mark, how would one become a part of this club?
I'm glad you asked, Dan. For just $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll get access to our exclusive new issue reviews, Swarm B-Book, mailbags, more than that. Just all during the off weeks in between these great grand episodes of all new Amazing Spider Talk. And Dan, if someone wants to be super generous and go for either $10 or more a month, you'll be sent exclusive commissioned artwork in the mail every 6 months. Dan, what's a better deal than that?
There is no better deal than that. So go check out our Patreon page over on patreon.com/Amazing Spider Talk, or go to either of our websites and click on the banner that reads Friendly Neighborhood Spider Talk Members Club to become part of the fun. Mark, speaking of fun, there's no more fun place on the internet other than Ron Frenz' social media accounts than your social media accounts. Where might we find them?
Yeah, well, of course, you can find me on Twitter at ChasingASMblog. And you can find my website, chasingamazingblog.com. You can find me on superiorspidertalk.com. You can order and or hopefully both read my book, 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die, from Triumph Books. And Dan, those of you who want to track me on the New York City Marathon app, I will be running in that this Sunday, November 5th, the first time in my life. Dan, I'm a little worried. I'm nervous.
You should be. Marathons are terrifying.
So, yeah, you know, you can download that app and punch in my name. If you spell it right, I'll come up and you'll know when I finish or if I finish.
That's awesome, Mark. I'm going to have to do that. Can we live taunt you while you're doing it?
I don't know if you can taunt me. I mean, unless you're in New York and you want to be on the route and just like at one point, like at mile like 11, have a sign that it's just like run like your life counts on it, Mark, and that annuals count or something like that.
I like this. I like this. I hope people do this. Awesome, Mark. If I could fly out there, you know, I would be at the finish line there to make fun of you.
I could just see you like at mile 5 being like, in this annual, meet up with Parker's parents. Mile 20. This is mile 21. This is the Peter and MJ marriage annual.
Do I just hold up the same sign when it's animals that are just repeated content?
There you go.
Please,
Anyway.
someone do this. Take your weekend and do this to mock Mark.
All right, there we go. I will take a photo with you if you do it. I will sacrifice potential seconds off my time to take a photo with you. Dan, where can we find you on social media?
When I'm not making fun of you, you can find me over at Sup Spider Talk on Twitter or on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. As we go through all of our changes to the site, some of you may have seen that I put a long letter up, a very long letter up about some of the changes that are going to be going on with that site. So I'm excited to see how you all respond to that and what's going to happen with our site going forward. I think good things. But yeah, go check that out over at SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. Now, Mark, this has been a long show. And so, you know, we may have forgotten some of the very things that happened at the beginning of the show. But there's one thing that we never forget, Mark.
Yes, and that thing is, with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.